On this Friday night, Israel's worst attack on the West Bank in decades. The deadly strike from a fighter jet as Iran's supreme leader defends its assault on Israel.
Was a completely legal and legitimate operation.
Yeah, we should go.
Up in flames, tragedy strikes a century-old building in Montreal. Heartache from Hurricane Helen, the tireless search for the missing.
Nobody was prepared for this.
The difficulties in delivering critical supplies and the Canadians lending a helping hand. And Beaver custody battle.
I shouldn't be working against the state.
Why the fate of this rodent has gnawed its way through the courts.
Global National, reporting tonight, Nitu Garcha.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. The escalating violence across the Middle East is claiming casualties on all fronts. Israel says 2 of its soldiers were killed in a drone strike in northern Israel, and there were dozens of deaths across Gaza, Lebanon, and the West Bank. Israel says it targeted Hezbollah and Hamas leadership, but it was mostly civilians who paid the price. And while Israel weighs what its response will be to Iran's missile attack earlier this week, U.S. President Joe Biden urged caution, clarifying remarks yesterday on whether the U.S. would support a strike on Iranian oil fields.
The Israelis have not concluded what they're going to do in terms of a strike. That's under discussion. I think if I were in their shoes, I'd be thinking about other alternatives than striking oil fields.
Israel has not stopped the bombardment elsewhere. Jeff Semple begins our coverage tonight.
For the past year, the occupied West Bank has been hit hard and often by Israeli raids and strikes, but nothing like this. This was a cafe with apartments in the floors above, now the site of the Palestinian territory's deadliest attack since the Second Intifada almost 25 years ago. This building obliterated Thursday by an airstrike not from a drone or a helicopter, but from an Israeli fighter jet. Israel says it was targeting a Hamas leader and other operatives who were plotting attacks. But the collateral damage is plain to see.
Well, the West Bank, no stranger to violence and funerals, but rarely anything on this scale. At least 18 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike yesterday, including children. So today we are seeing mass protests and mass funerals.
The youngest of the 18 victims, these siblings, 7-year-old Sham Muhammad Abu Zara and her 8-year-old brother Karam. This crime was committed with American weapons, the children's uncle told us. They always cover up Israel's crimes, he says.
This terrible airstrike is also an indication of how ruthless these attacks have become.
This Palestinian political leader says if it was a cafe in Tel Aviv, there would be international condemnation.
But in our case, to my knowledge, there is no single condemnation of this Israeli behavior.
They said there's a Hamas commander sitting at that cafe.
Even if there was a fighter or a Hamas commander or even a criminal, as they call them, this does not justify shooting and killing people around him.
That message is echoed by the United Nations regarding the fighting across Israel's other border in Lebanon.
The toll on civilians from this campaign is totally unacceptable.
Lebanese officials are reporting the heaviest bombings to date in and around the capital. Reports say Israel was targeting this man, Hashem Safadine, widely expected to be Hezbollah's next leader. So far, no official word on whether he was hit. Israel's ground offensive is now reaching far beyond the UN's designated buffer zone set back in 2006, which Hezbollah had long ignored. The number of evacuations and casualties grows by the hour.
At least 100 children have been killed in the last 10, 11 days, and hundreds more have been injured.
A glimmer of hope for those civilians caught in the crossfire tonight. A report from Israeli broadcaster Channel 12, citing security sources, claims the Israeli military is aiming to wrap up the intense fighting in the next 3 to 4 weeks and will then pursue ceasefire deals in both the north and the south. Nithu?
Okay, Jeff Semple in Jerusalem tonight. Thanks, Jeff. As the region waits on edge for Israel's next move, Iran's supreme leader made a rare address during Friday prayers in Tehran. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei called his country's attack on Israel earlier this week legal and legitimate, saying it was the minimum punishment for Israel's killing of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Iran's supreme leader also reached out to members and supporters of Iran's proxy groups across the Middle East. Redmond Shannon explains the significance of the speech.
Tens of thousands at Tehran's Grand Mosque. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei leading Friday prayers there for the first time since the assassination of Revolutionary Guard commander Qasem Soleimani 4 years ago. This time he led mourning for Hassan Nasrallah, the Lebanese leader of Iranian-funded Hezbollah, killed in an Israeli airstrike on Beirut a week ago. He also lauded Iran's missile response against Israel.
The brilliant action of our armed forces was a completely legal and legitimate operation.
Gripping the head of a rifle, Khamenei called the Hamas October 7th attacks on Israel right and legal. Iran also funds Hamas. The supreme leader then switched from his native Farsi to Arabic, encouraging those proxy groups of Iran to resist Israel. He said Iran itself would not back down, although he didn't issue a direct threat.
Khamenei was cautious.
This Iran analyst says citizen support for the regime's actions is far from universal.
There are many within Iran for whom Gaza and Lebanon are fringe issues, if you want, and are concerned about the impact this has on Iran's general relationship with the world.
In Beirut, his foreign minister met with Lebanon's prime minister, an interim leader managing a country that was in crisis long before this.
The Lebanese government in general now, they need support, humanitarian aid from any quarter. So of course they are not going to say, well, I'm not going to take help from the Iranians.
Abbas Arakchi promised support for Shiite Muslims in Lebanon and all Lebanese too, even though many of them at least partly blame Iran for the current state of their nation. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
American forces carried out strikes against targets linked to Iran-backed Houthi fighters in Yemen today. The U.S. says it targeted the Houthis' offensive military capabilities to protect freedom of navigation and make international waters safer. The Houthis have carried out nearly 100 attacks on ships crossing the Red Sea since November. Western nations, including Canada, are ramping up their military presence in Cyprus to be ready if their citizens need to be evacuated out of Lebanon. Mercedes Stevenson is there monitoring the military buildup. Mercedes?
Neithu, while Cyprus isn't part of the conflict in the Middle East, you can see and feel the effects. Cyprus is geographically close to Israel and Lebanon. While it's part of Europe, it looks so much like Lebanon that Israeli special forces have been training here for years, including this past summer as they prepared for their current operations. At the time, the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, threatened Cyprus, saying it had, quote, become part of the war. Military buildup around the island is unmistakable. Transport planes from air forces around the world now appear frequently in the skies above the port city of Larnaca. Many filled with troops and equipment to help evacuate their respective citizens from Lebanon if required. And tomorrow, around 150 Canadian soldiers will arrive here at the Larnaca airport, boosting the number of Canadian troops in the region to approximately 200. Some, including Special Operations Forces, have been in Lebanon contingency planning in case they need to evacuate Canadians out. That includes some Special Operations Forces who've been on the ground in Lebanon helping to plan a potential evacuation. But sources say as long as the Beirut airport remains open to commercial flights, any evacuation plan is likely on hold. Neithu?
All right, Mercedes Stevenson in Larnaca, Cyprus. Thanks, Mercedes. Global News has learned Imperial Oil in southern Ontario is facing one of the largest environmental fines the province has issued, and it's all due to an oil spill back in 2021. The refinery has been ordered to pay $1.1 million. More than 1,000 liters of slop oil leaked into the ground. The refinery is located on the south side of Sarnia, roughly 1 kilometer from Aamjiwnaang First Nation. Carolyn Jarvis has been investigating environmental concerns in the area for about a decade and joins us now. Carolyn?
Neetu, on April 15th, 2021, a dozen people started reporting headaches, nausea, and that their eyes and throats were burning. Members of Aamjiwnaang First Nation posted online about a terrible smell, like burnt rubber, that some say made them run inside. That smell was coming from Imperial Oil. There was a leak in a steam line, which in turn bored a hole in a slop oil line, discharging it to the ground. A slop oil is a waste product that's typically a mixture of crude oil and waste solids. And while strong odors were reported, air monitoring didn't detect any hydrogen sulfide or benzene. Still, Imperial Oil was charged under Ontario's Environmental Protection Act and pleaded guilty. It has since created more urgency around equipment maintenance so something like this doesn't happen again. One interesting note here, Neetu, is that money from that fine will largely go to the county of Lambton, where Imperial operates, and not to Aamjiwnaang First Nation, which, as you can imagine, isn't sitting well with everyone there.
Carolyn, on the north side of Aamjiwnaang, this week there's also been renewed concern about elevated levels of the cancer-causing chemical benzene.
Neetu, and that's because of a different industrial neighbor, a chemical plant called Styrolution that's only meters away. Under government order, it was instructed to remove benzene from its facilities. So, this week, Aamjiwnaang First Nation residents who live close by were told to leave, some moving to hotels as a precaution. This comes after significant benzene emissions last spring, prompting the First Nation to declare a state of emergency, and the province and the feds stepped in. INEOS previously said those emissions never breached the limits at the time. It's hoped most residents will be allowed to return home Sunday. INEOS has previously said it is permanently closing the plant by June 2026. Neetu?
Carolyn Jarvis in Toronto. Thanks, Carolyn. A 13-year-old boy has been charged with first-degree murder in the stabbing death of a man in Toronto. Officers found the 54-year-old stabbed in a parking lot early Tuesday morning. He's not being identified until his family can be notified. Memorials have been set up outside a restaurant and car dealership where he would often sit. Fire rips through a historic building in Montreal. Coming up, the terrifying escapes for people in the middle of the night. In Montreal, multiple people are missing, and it's expected some will be found dead after a major fire overnight. Flames ripped through a century-old building housing a hostel. Police are investigating the fire as suspicious. It happened less than a kilometer away from the site of a deadly fire last year. And as Mike Armstrong explains, both buildings share an important link.
Those were right in the middle, babe.
Yo, should we go?
Yeah, we go.
It was a harrowing wake-up in the middle of the night. The building housed a restaurant and a cafe on the first floor and a 19-room hostel on the second and third floors. A fire alarm did go off.
When I went on the street, there was this girl screaming, the kitchen's burning, and then there was an explosion, and then we ran, basically.
The flames spread quickly. The focus for firefighters in the first hours was defensive, trying to stop it from spreading. 3 people were taken to hospital and others are missing. Police aren't saying how many.
Based on the first people we spoke to, we expect to find victims, unfortunately.
A phone number has been set up for anyone who might have a loved one missing. Because it was a hostel, many would have been tourists. Investigators are going through the registry.
You don't know how, if people came in for just a few days, did they register one person but had a few guests?
Now, this area of the city, Old Montreal, had another fire in March of last year, about 900 meters to the west. The 2 fires have something in common. Both buildings are owned by the same person. That building was also used for short-term rentals. 7 people were killed, again, most from out of town. Following that tragedy, there was a blitz of inspections. The fire department confirms it ordered changes at the building with the hostel and followed up.
Everything what we did was corrected as we asked.
One thing visible in postings for the hostel are that there were rooms without windows. That's not necessarily in contravention of bylaws, but it did make people nervous.
It was like a closet with a bed. That's it. So I contemplated, should I stay here, should I go? But then I thought, well, I can sleep here for one night.
Now, part of the structure has collapsed, and what is still standing has to be deemed safe before investigators can go in. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
An army of volunteers in the air as devastation grows on the ground. Ahead, we'll take stock 1 week after Hurricane Helene. In northern India, unrelenting rainfall caused a river to burst its banks, sending a torrent of water into a residential neighborhood in a city home to 800,000 people. The flooding has swamped homes and the surrounding farmland. Roads connecting nearby villages have been washed away. Flash flooding forced the evacuation of about 100 elephants from a sanctuary in Thailand's mountainous north. The nature park says some elephants were swept away and 2 are still missing. The sanctuary is home to healthy but also injured, neglected and elderly elephants, as well as other rescued animals. The cleanup is underway in Taiwan after being pummeled by a powerful typhoon. Typhoon Kraton has been downgraded to a tropical depression after slamming into Taiwan's southwestern coastline on Thursday. The severe storm caused extensive damage to businesses, blew out windows of buildings, triggered landslides, and toppled hundreds of trees in the country's biggest port city. In North America, we call typhoons hurricanes, and 1 week ago today, a devastating one. Hurricane Helene made landfall. These before and after images show a snapshot of the devastation in parts of North Carolina, where several mountain towns were hit by flash floods. More than 40 trillion gallons of rain drenched the southeast U.S. If that was concentrated over the state of North Carolina, it would cover the entire state with more than a meter of water. Helene is the deadliest hurricane since Katrina. At least 220 people have died. And as Jackson Prosco reports, the scale of damage remains difficult to fathom.
Each passing day reveals heartbreaking new images of Helene's destruction.
It's going to hit the pool though right here.
1 week after the storm's catastrophic arrival, the disaster is still unfolding.
We are still in a crisis mode. We are still in the search and rescue mode.
Water rescue teams are still looking for hundreds of people who are missing.
It's beyond anything I've ever seen.
Asheville, North Carolina, population 100,000, took the brunt of the heavy rains and flooding. Much of the city's water system is destroyed. Entire neighborhoods are gone. So are countless lives.
There are people that died in the storm that lived in homes in areas that had never before experienced flooding.
As residents dig through the waterlogged mess of their homes, they're finding little left to salvage. Few people had flood insurance.
Nobody was prepared for this. I mean, 30 feet of water coming down the valley was just something none of us ever imagined.
In the mountains of North Carolina, this is still the only way to get supplies in and people out. A small air force of private helicopter operators is working around the clock.
We were some of the first people in the area to begin bringing in aid.
Thousands of federal aid workers and troops are now on the ground, along with more than 750 line workers from eastern Canada who are working to restore power, a job that could take weeks.
There's still huge amounts of infrastructure here that we just simply haven't been able to get to because, bridges are out or roads are out.
Rebuilding some of those roads could take 6 months to a year, while the cost of this disaster is estimated at $35 billion and counting. Yet few can think about moving on when they're still trying to understand all they've lost. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Nibby's future. Next, why this beaver is the subject of a court case in Massachusetts. We tend to think of beavers as Canada's national animal, but it's 2-year-old Nibby in Massachusetts garnering lots of attention in a bitter legal battle. An animal rescue center has been fighting state officials over whether the rescued beaver is allowed to stay with them or be released into the wild. Heidi Petracek explains what happened next in a case showing just how complicated rehabilitating these creatures can be.
Leave it to a beaver to make a splash. This beaver's tale begins when state officials told Newhouse Wildlife Rescue, about an hour outside of Boston, the orphaned animal would have to be released back into the wild this month after living at the sanctuary for 2 years.
No one from Mass Wildlife has been here to assess her. No one from Mass Wildlife has ever met this beaver.
The rescue's founder said attempts to integrate Nibby with other beavers have been unsuccessful and worried Nibby wouldn't survive on her own.
I don't think she's going to make it.
So the fight was on to save the little critter, and nearly 30,000 people signed a petition lobbying against its release.
Beavers can be very difficult cases.
Nova Scotia wildlife rescuer Hope Swinnermer knows what it's like to try to get a rescued beaver back to nature. She released 2 herself in September. The key, making sure they don't get too attached to too many people. Although,
no matter how good you may become at wildlife rehab, you always have those occasional cases where the animal becomes imprinted on a whole bunch of people. And that can definitely be a red flag for not to release the animal to the wild.
The staff here argued Nibby should stay as their educational animal. State politicians, damn it all, called on the governor to intervene.
We're getting close to Thanksgiving, right? Maybe she can pardon the beaver instead of a turkey.
Hours before a Friday court date, the governor said Nibby could stay.
Woo! Nibby's even excited, huh, Nibby?
She's not just a beaver. She's an innocent animal in all of this, and there's a lot of respect and love for wildlife.
Wouldn't you know, her fans approve. This eager beaver will be sticking around. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Halifax.
Quite the loyal fan club indeed. That is Global National for this Friday night. I'm Neetu Garcha. Tonight's Your Canada is the Northern Lights over Melfort, Nova Scotia. And if the sky is clear where you are tonight and tomorrow, you have a good chance of seeing the Northern Lights, so check it out. We love seeing your Canada. Please email your photos to globalnational@globalnews.ca. Thanks so much for watching and hope you can join us again tomorrow. Have a great night.